Gris is a puzzle platformer game that released in 2018, developed by Nomada Studio. It was the studio's debut release and received quite the critical attention when it came out. Now, I think it was very, very much the talk of the town at release, but has quickly died out in attention. And I saw it get a lot of very high praise, but when I actually sat down to play myself, I did not have a very good experience. Because there are some aspects I love quite a bit, and so many parts of it that I find really, really poor. So I would really like to get into it and review this game so that I can share my experience and what my problems were with it, and what I hope to see improved in the future. I don't think praise of this game has been uncritical, and I don't mean to imply so. I'm not at all the first person to have problems with the game, but I just want to break down my experience first. I don't think there's too much to discuss before we just jump in. After all, it's a debut title, so there isn't a past history of games to look at. So we'll begin with what I consider the most important aspect of the game is the visuals, the animations. It is the selling point, the sticking point, it's the critical darling, and the best example of flowing, gorgeous 2D animation in a game. It has a wonderful watercolor style that keeps the colors and backgrounds simple, so that the delicate and complicated line art never becomes overwhelming and messy. For as beautiful as I find games like Hollow Knight, for example, the absolute density on screen can sometimes be a little bit detrimental to the overall visual look. And games like Spiritfarer, which have a quite similar style, simply does not boast the absolute quality and delicate art style that Gris has. There were some aspects that I did find slightly cheap. Like I said, I love the watercolor look, but there were clearly some effects done which were basically just like playing footage of ink and water over the game at low opacity, which was a little bit jarring. Not to say it ruined the aesthetic at all, but rather just to suggest it's not completely perfect visually. But certainly my most uncomplicated feelings lie in the visuals, and they're easily what pulled me through the game even during my greatest frustrations. Another aspect that made the game go down so easy was its length. At only a few hours, it is easy to complete the game in a single weekend without much trouble at all. That's another great decision, as it means they didn't have to stretch out their visual budget across more gameplay, so nothing was ever visually repetitive or monotonous, and everything was given the proper care and attention it deserves. I'm a massive fan of short games. Quick, almost like film-length experiences that you can pop on and digest easily. It also provides ample replayability. I dive back into games like A Short Hike for a fun time just whenever I feel like it. But regardless, I appreciate that it does not outstay its welcome, and I understand when people talk about value or worth or anything like that. It feels a little divorced from video games as an art form rather than like a product. I think it was perfect that this was short and sweet. However, now we have to tackle my main two issues with Gris, its gameplay and its story. First, we're going to get into the gameplay. More than anything else, it's a puzzle platformer, but also sort of an experience game. What I mean when I say experience game is that it's designed to be moved through more than to challenge you. A lot of like walking sims fall under that definition, like What Remains of Edith Finch, but there are many other examples such as The Artful Escape or Florence. Most of the gameplay is pretty linear, and puzzles for a majority of the game aren't exactly meant to test your problem solving. It's just performing the different actions in the only order you're able to. By the second to last area of the game, the puzzles have turned into slightly more challenging affair, but certainly not something that you can't just overcome with brute force in like a minute or two. And I have a problem with this. It just isn't good gameplay, like, at all. The platforming is non-existent. Only the very occasional situation are you punished for missing a single jump, and the punishment is just the annoyance of returning to the spot where you just were. Sometimes there's not even a jump to miss, and it's just making your way through. You can't sprint or challenge yourself by going through the platforming as fast as possible, because the game doesn't want you to. It wants you to calmly take in the scenery and to bask in the atmosphere. I don't have a problem with that on its own, but my issue is that it's sort of clashing with the random obstacles of puzzles. As I said, the puzzles aren't interesting at all. They're not even designed to really make you think. Just do the only sequence of events possible. Use the ability you gained in this location at the only point of interest available. That sort of thing. But why put these gameplay interruptions in at all? It would have been improved if it was even shorter and they didn't stop you every few minutes for this, and they let you just completely get lost in the atmosphere. I couldn't let myself get immersed in the art and the feelings when they put up a big stop sign in front of me before I put a square peg into a square hole. It feels like these puzzles were added to either artificially lengthen the already short game time. And I acknowledge that it might have been necessary, as like I said before, the average gamer would not be happy to spend money on something even a bit shorter than this, which I think is a shame. I find the art more than valuable enough, even if I take issue with every other aspect of the game. But they've made the game itself worse in order to add perceived value, because nothing is gained from puzzles that are this simple and uninteresting. You're not inspired to think, and it does take you out of the emotions the game is attempting to instill. But if we bring the comparison to similar experience style games, I think the other issue becomes glaringly obvious. In general, I have some problems with these types of games. They don't always affect me as much as they seem to do for others, and that's fine, everyone's experience is their own. But even then, I do like a good few of them. They just tend to lean heavily on the story that accompanies them, whether it be engaging characters, nuanced themes, or some sort of message. But I really think Gris falls flat on its face in any attempt to create a narrative experience. I'm not sure if this is a particularly controversial opinion, or if the greatest fans will admit that the story isn't very in-depth or interesting. Basically, there isn't exactly like a narrative directly throughout the game, but each of the levels are supposed to abstractly represent stages of grief. However, I just don't feel it really says anything. It vaguely gestures at certain concepts, but they aren't very substanceful observations. Take the second of the 5 stages, and the first real level of the game, Anger. The color palette is red, and occasionally the player is blocked by a gust of red wind. I interpret this as the waves of unstable and impatient anger impeding the character's path forward, which is pretty simple, but honestly decently effective narratively. But it does make the puzzle solving far more frustrating. Considering the simple nature of the gameplay, these sorts of things can make the game feel like a slog, despite its really short runtime. But I did want to take this moment to acknowledge this piece, as it's the part I like the most. I think there is something to say with this level, despite the gameplay annoyance, or perhaps in part of it. I like it when games have something to say, and this is something where the gameplay itself is instilling a feeling or trying to teach you something, rather than it just yelling obvious things at you. And this is something that you can kind of mull on as you go through the otherwise dull puzzle platforming. But upon further consideration, what also robs the depth of the point is that I don't find that very unique to anger. Basically every part of grief could be portrayed as a metaphor physically impeding the player. All of it is self-destructive and must be calmly pushed through in order to move on. So I don't find it as effective as it could be, considering that it isn't particularly poignant. And then it gets even worse when I feel it's easily the strongest example in the game, and the next few levels can barely keep up with even this. For example, I'd say the second strongest is the 4th chapter, the one that represents depression. But only to the extent that the level is dark and takes place largely underwater. The imagery of drowning or darkness to represent depression is incredibly common and nothing that interesting. I didn't even really see much to pick up on in chapter 1 and 3, denial and bargaining respectively. Though it's important to mention that could be just my inability to get anything out of it, not a complete lack of substance, but still, there's just very little actually to this game. It almost feels like it's under the impression that it's far more deep than it is. Now, don't take any of this complaining as my lack of interest in tackling these topics. I think video games are still sort of in a philosophical paddling pool narratively. There are many exceptions where unbelievable nuance can be conveyed, and those tend to be some of my favorite games of all time. Personally, some examples of that would be Persona 3, the Nier series, Silent Hill 2, and the like. Those aren't super niche picks, but each of them offer up so much more and can tackle topics on the scale and at the higher level of other mediums, in my opinion. And if we're to get into indie games specifically, I found the narratives in Disco Elysium, 1000 X Resist, Mouthwashing or Celeste to be far more valuable, even though they vary in actual narrative focus. What I mean to say is what truly frustrated me about Gris is not that I found it to be a bad game, but instead, it was that I saw hints of something pretty great and interesting buried beneath the most bland and simple design. The puzzle platforming was incredibly lackluster and honestly amateur, while the story was not impressive at all. I want so much more out of it. Despite being wordless and an artsy feeling thing, I actually think it's pretty simple and designed for mass audiences. I know I might be sounding a bit pretentious myself, or out of touch, I don't know. But it bothers me when something so shallow seems to think it has so much to say. Either way, what I do think is that the developer has a lot of room to grow. This is a debut title for Nomada Studio after all, which means this could be the blueprint for better things to come. Since Gris, they have put out one other game, Neva, in 2024. I've yet to play it, but I'm a lot more hopeful, despite my negative feelings on Gris. The art style remains just as astounding, and I'd love to see the style paired with something I find a bit more interesting. So instead of ending on a negative note, I will end on the hope for Neva and whatever else may come next. I might put out a review of Neva when I finally get around to it, so if you'd like to see that, please do let me know. If you're a big fan of this game and made it this far, I commend you. It's not always nice hearing a review that disagrees with you so much, but I hope I got you to think, even if you arrive at a conclusion completely different to mine. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.